Hello, I'm Chris. I'm going to talk to you about some books. This is all the books that I've read from the beginning of the year up until April. I'm going to try and do this chronologically. Some of them are good, some of them are not so good. Let's go. In January, I started with Apples Never Fall by Liane Moriarty. It's a multi-character family drama, mystery element thrown in a little bit. It's about a family called the Delaneys. The parents were tennis coaches and they ran this tennis academy, and all of the kids ordered tennis to various degrees of their life. It's about how they grow up, and then kind of in flashbacks telling that story, while there's a present day story of the mother of the family who has gone missing. It's what Liane Moriarty does really well, which is the lots of different characters and how they all interact with each other, the family dynamics, all of that kind of thing. I cannot stress enough how much tennis there is in this book, and I'm not really interested in tennis, like, at all. I don't care about tennis. I didn't think this would be an issue going into the book, but actually it was too much tennis for me. I just didn't care. Like, every time they started talking about tennis, I was like, just waiting for it to be over. It was like when people in books talk about dreams and I immediately stop reading, I just skip it. It's not real. I don't care. It doesn't matter. Even if it's relevant to the plot, I literally don't read it. It was like that, but with tennis. Also, at the very end, it does mention the pandemic. And I know that this is going to happen more and more with books as like time goes on, but I'd rather we didn't. I'd just rather we didn't. Let's just pretend it never happened. Do we have to mention it? I don't think so. Next up was The Bookshop. This is set in the 1950s and it's about a woman who moves to a village by the seaside in Sussex, I think, and she decides to open a bookshop, but it turns out that the inhabitants of the village don't want a bookshop, actually quite strongly don't want a bookshop, and it's about the trials and tribulations she faces in this small village trying to run this bookshop and having a very difficult time of it because of various things that happen and the characters that are resistant to it. It's a really quick read, a really short book, but I really loved just the writing, the atmosphere. I thought it was just really lovely. I just really enjoyed it. I think if you're not into kind of small town life, little like gossip about everyone, being up in everyone's business kind of books, this maybe won't be that interesting for you, but I really enjoyed it. I got really attached to the main character, Florence, and I was absolutely fuming that she was being wronged by these like nasty people in the town. I just really enjoyed the way it was written. It was just very witty, really funny at times actually, but kind of in a very understated way. Lie With Me by Philippe Besson. It's a bestseller, award-winning, very short also French novel, which is about two young boys who are 17 having a relationship and becoming lovers in the 80s, and it's told by the narrator in present day who is kind of reminiscing about it. I didn't really feel that I was getting into it. It felt very standoffish and kind of cold. Like the narration and the way it was written just felt like the main character wasn't like involved in his own life in a way. And I don't know if that's maybe the translation or something, where it's like in the original French it would be somehow different, but I didn't really find it to be particularly compelling. I also did listen to this as an audiobook, and I think the slightly robotic delivery of the person reading the audiobook maybe contributed to that. So maybe that's on me, maybe it's on the format, who knows, but I wasn't obsessed, it was just okay. Next up was The Pisces by Melissa Broder. I don't want to say anything about this book because anything that I will tell you about it will spoil it. If you want to read the book, just go and read the book. It's worth it, it's really good. The less you know about it, the more fun it's going to be reading it. I was worried this wouldn't stick the ending, because you know when sometimes you're reading a book and you're like, I'm having such a good time with this, I'm enjoying this so much, don't fuck up the ending. Like I'm begging you, I'm praying, do not mess up the ending. And it didn't. I was really psyched by the ending being, it was good. It was good the whole way through, and it ended in a strong way. Some parts of this book are kind of hard to enjoy. A difficult read, not in that it's hard to read, but like it's hard to read. But I would just recommend it. Read it, just let me know what you think. Next book is The Sanatorium by Sarah Pearse. This was a book that actually drove me to start making notes. I was so enraged by how much I was just fuming about this book. Like, I hated this book, that I was driven to start making notes about it. That's how angry I was. This is a mystery thriller set in the Swiss Alps, and the main character is a detective on leave, so she's British. The premise is fine. It's a perfectly fine premise for an atmospheric thriller, but the execution of this book was insane. None of it made sense. Everything about it was ridiculous. Not even just the ending, which was ridiculous. The whole way through, the descriptions in this book are like nothing I've ever heard. She constantly talks as if like the air is pressing in on her. She sounds as if she's like having some kind of trauma response to literally everything. There's one point in the book where she sits down in the restaurant and there's a whole thing about how like there's a film on top of the soup, and she's like repulsed by the film on top of the soup. She walks into the hotel room and the hotel room has sharp edges, and she looks out at a full plate glass window at the beautiful Alps and the mountains outside, and she's like horrified by the size of it all or something. I don't know, like everything is horrible to her, which is like the most bizarre thing to read. The idea of this book is basically an old sanatorium in the Swiss Alps where people used to go to recover from TB, I think, is converted into a luxury hotel. So these characters go to this hotel and then the deaths begin. And through an unfortunate snowstorm, which is very convenient, it means that not a single police officer can be found. No one can go up there because they're very high up in the mountain. And for that reason, the only person that can possibly investigate these crimes is Ellen, who is this detective from Britain. Now, unfortunately, Ellen is the worst detective of all time. She is genuinely one of the most useless people in the entire world. She could not solve her way out of a paper bag, let alone several crimes. Watching her do it was infuriating. She just didn't do the most basic things that anyone would do if you'd ever watched a TV show or read a book about solving crimes. And she was supposed to be a detective. So that was weird. I didn't know why she had to be a detective until I went to rate this book badly on Goodreads, and I realized that this is actually the first of a series. So that's why she has to be a detective. So presumably she can go on in the second book of the series, also incompetently solving another crime, but hopefully this time not in the Alps, so she won't feel quite so oppressed by the air being thick and viscous, which is, how can the air be thick and viscous up in the mountains where the air is thin? That's the whole thing about mountain air. Honestly, I just didn't get it. This is like a really big bestseller. It keeps being recommended to me on stuff, and I don't understand why. I don't know who enjoyed this book. Maybe also people who didn't listen to the audiobook, where the pronunciation of several names was completely wild to me. Like, I did not understand. There's a character in it called Margot, and as far as I'm aware, that's how you pronounce Margot. Margot. The T is silent, right? But they pronounce it with a hard T, Margot. And they said Margot like 1,000 times. Margot this, Margot that. And I was like, what is happening? Like, it made me question everything. Do I not know how to say Margot? Am I wrong? Have I been wrong all along? It made me question everything, life itself, whether I should be a detective because I could do it better than she could, everything. So I suppose it made me think, but not in a good way. Next I read Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin. This was really good. I wish I'd actually read it as a paper book. I think I might try and reread, because I think the beauty of the book is really just in the language and the way it's written. And again, at the beginning of the year I was doing a lot of audiobooks because I was doing a lot of knitting, and I really enjoyed it, but I think I would actually appreciate even more just having time to read the words and like enjoy them, because that seems like the beauty of that book. It's set in the 1950s in Paris, and it's about an American man who goes to Paris. He meets a girl and becomes engaged to her, and then he also starts having a relationship with another man, and it's about this affair that they have, which, you know, his kind of complex feelings about it, and then I don't really want to say anymore not to spoil it, but it's really in the atmosphere of the writing, it's in like the language, and it was very evocative. Like, I really felt, unlike the sanatorium nonsense, this didn't need to tell me that things were oppressive. You felt it, you know, like when it's done so well by someone that's such an incredible writer, they don't need to tell you, you just feel that from the way that, you know, the scene is written. And I haven't read any James Baldwin before, so I definitely will read more, but would highly recommend if you haven't read it. And the last book I read in January was The Hacienda, How Not to Run a Club by Peter Hook. Peter Hook is the bassist and co-founder of Joy Division and New Order, and the book is basically a little bit about kind of the music side, but mostly about running the Hacienda, which was a club that originally kind of started as a live venue in Manchester in the 80s, and it kind of chronicles its progression from live venue where loads of bands played to a DJ, kind of superstar DJ culture and acid house and that kind of whole dance scene, and then kind of the fall of the whole thing of the venue and how it all fell apart due to finances, but also things like gangsters. And it's super fun, really fun, loads of really fun stories. If you're into like any of that music, definitely a fun one to read. He's just got some hilarious, insane stories. I don't think you need to take it super seriously. I think quite a few people, when I read some of the reviews of this, find Peter Hook himself quite annoying, like his ego and his way of being, I guess. But I found it quite fun, so it didn't really bother me. It was super interesting to read about, because in a way, what was interesting about it was because of the impact that it's had, it was interesting to see that actually at the beginning it wasn't like that big of a hit and that no one was that bothered. So for something that has such like cultural impact later on was actually like quite a struggle to get off the ground at the start. Also, I just thought it was great as a way of feeling like if you're a business owner, it was just enjoyable to read people talk about how absolutely terrible of a job they did. I mean, they did a genuinely terrible job of running that club. Like, everyone was clueless and also on a lot of drugs, so I don't know, what would you expect? It was fascinating just kind of what a money pit that whole project was. And I didn't actually know that like the vast majority of New Order's existence was essentially just a way to funnel money into running this club that was burning through money at the rate of like thousands of pounds seemingly an hour. So they'd have to like go and record an album and make a record just so they could continue funding this club, which was really interesting. I thought it was really fun, enjoyed it. Onwards. In February, I read Flight. This is a very difficult to define book. It's officially a novel, but it's kind of different pieces of writing rather than a classic narrative structure. It's like 160 something pieces of writing roughly on the subject of travel. Some of it is very tenuously linked, but it all kind of comes together in the end. There are some parts that are much more narrative, and there are some parts that are almost essays. I found a really good quote from the London Review of Books that said, "It's essay clusters embedded between sections of narrative." That's exactly what it is. Very good, London Review of Books. Their review is also probably much better than mine, because I find it very difficult to define what this book was about. You do have to commit. Like, this is not a book that you're lying down to bed and like doing a casual few pages. You need to concentrate, you need to sit down, you need to put the work in. But I did think it was really worth it. There are some pieces in this that are almost short stories or like standalone stories inside the kind of other overarching narratives. And there's a really standout one which is also called Flights, like the main title, which is about a woman who, instead of going home to her family and her child, just rides around on the metro in Moscow all day and kind of almost drops out of society for a short period of time. I don't know why, but for some reason I just keep thinking about it. Like, it's really stuck with me, and I've just kept, like, occasionally I just sit there thinking about it, and it was just very compelling. The way that she writes is so interesting. You're gonna need to work at it, but it was worth working at, so recommend. Next up, Jonathan Coe, number 11. This is the second Jonathan Coe book I've read. I've read Middle England, and it's also the second time I've read the second in a series by him without realizing that it was the second in a series. Luckily with this, it doesn't really matter. You don't have to have read the first one for it to have made sense. It's more of a continuation. It's about two childhood best friends, and it follows them as they start out as children and they kind of come of age, grow up, and begin their lives. It's kind of interweaving narratives where we drop in on them in different times, and sometimes they are the main character in the story, and sometimes they kind of pop up as a side character, but they're kind of the thread in the story. It's super funny, like, it's a satire, so it's like kind of absurd, but in the way that it portrays true contemporary Britain in its absurdity. The interweaving narratives are, I found, really satisfying because it all comes together at the end in an incredibly satisfying way. I think Jonathan Coe is like an incredible chronicler of British culture, and he does it so well in a way that doesn't feel like he has contempt for his characters. Like, he treats the banality of his characters' lives with such care and almost love that I think it makes them very compelling to read about, because they are just mostly normal people living very normal lives. I don't want to make it sound boring, because it's not boring at all. Literally, as soon as I started reading it, I couldn't put it down, and it was like a riot. It's really fun. There is a section in this where the chapter's called Nate of the Station, and it's about a police officer called Nate. So it's a pun of State of the Nation, which is what this is, a State of the Nation satire. Really good, really enjoyed it. I now need to read the first one in the series and also everything else that Jonathan Coe's ever written, because I think I really love him as a writer. I've got a lot to be getting on with. Next, I read The Paris Apartment by Lucy Foley. I've really enjoyed her previous two books, The Hunting Party and The Guest List, which I thought were really fun in that kind of mystery thriller genre. I think she does so well with these stories where a whole group of characters are in a place, for example, at a wedding reception or at a party or something, and we kind of see and try and work out what's going on in this thriller in this kind of contained environment. And in this occasion, it's the Paris apartment. I didn't enjoy this as much as I hoped. I had really high expectations just to like have a fun time, not like high expectations for it to be high literature, but I just wanted to have a really fun time. Like when I read one of these thrillers, I just want to have a good time. I want to sit down, I want to be like sucked in, I want to be captivated and not want to put the book down. And this was just a bit slow moving. It was just a bit slow paced. It wasn't grabbing me. It's a crime drama, elements of dysfunctional family. There's basically a main character that comes from London to Paris to stay with her brother, and when she gets there, she finds that he is not there, but there is this apartment, the Paris apartment. But then over time, things start to seem like something's off, and she starts thinking that maybe something bad has happened to him and kind of investigating, trying to find out more, and then getting involved with these other people that live in this building and trying to work out how they're involved, how they knew her brother and how they know each other and how they interact with each other. And it all kind of comes together in this mystery thriller. But I just didn't think it had much meat to it. Like there wasn't just, it was fine. It was fine, it was good, but I wasn't like sucked in and I wasn't dying to find out what happened next. I was just like reading it and then I was like, oh, okay, it's fine, it's over, moved on. It was good, but I wasn't obsessed. The Post Office Girl by Stefan Zweig. This was amazing. I was completely obsessed with this. I had no idea what this book was. I picked it up in my local most favourite secondhand bookshop where everything they stock is like insanely good. The cover looked a bit like it would be one of those emotional memoirs of a geisha type books. Read the back and I was like, okay, bought it. Didn't really know too much about it. I was like obsessed. I was completely captivated by this from the start. This is billed as a haunting yet compassionate retelling of a Cinderella story, which I don't think really captures its breadth of how good it was. This opens in Austria just after World War I, and the main character, Christine, works in the post office, a local provincial post office, and she is the post office girl. And she is 26, if I remember correctly, and because of the war, she really feels like she kind of lost her youth to the war. She is prematurely old, like her life is over. She's never going to do anything again. Most of where she lives and her family and everyone she knows are in great poverty because of the war, and she doesn't really have any opportunity, and this is basically her life. She's going to be working in this provincial post office and her life is essentially over. And then suddenly she gets a telegram from a wealthy aunt of hers who through marriage has emigrated and become very rich and now lives in America. So her aunt and her husband are coming back to Europe and they invite Christine to come and stay with them in the Swiss Alps. So she goes, and then there is a kind of glow up montage where she gets a makeover and she gets a haircut and she gets a whole new wardrobe and she becomes a whole new Christine. She becomes like young again, and she's sort of transformed, and she sees herself as transformed as well. She's kind of blown away by the change in her with her appearance and how people then start to react to her, and everyone thinks that she's also this young rich woman, and she kind of plays along. She like goes along with it and enjoys it for the first time in her life. She experiences luxury, what it's like to live in a completely different way and to be wealthy, not to have a care in the world, to have access to beautiful clothes and to go dancing, to meet men and to kind of get attention for the first time in her life. She gets kind of her head turned by that, starts to kind of lean into it a little bit. The second half of the book is much more dark, but in a really great way, in that it sort of felt like it had light and shade. Like you had this first sparkly part of the book where everything's magical, and then the second part of the book where everything's quite dark, but like reality sort of comes in. I thought this was brilliant. really good. I haven't ever heard anyone talk about this book, and I think they should. I thought it was really great. Would recommend. I don't think anyone needs my review of maybe the most anticipated, the most heavily reviewed book of this year so far, but I will tell you, I didn't really like it. I was super excited about it, couldn't wait, was like fully pre-order, let's go, really hyped, and I just didn't like it. I didn't think it was good. Of the structure of the books, and it's several books, I will not believe this is one book. These are several books, very flimsily stapled together. The last one was maybe the most compelling, where it's basically a story of a pandemic. So my desire to read about a pandemic ever, but specifically now, post-pandemic, is very low. But unfortunately, that was the most interesting part of that book. So that was a shame. It just went on forever. It went on and on and on. I found it really charmless, even when it was kind of being self-referential. It made fun of itself for being like, oh, all the characters are the same names, and oh, like that's a lot of Davids because everyone in this book is called David. And it just didn't feel like it was fun or good. Everything in this book was telling me rather than showing me. It was just very relentless, kept explaining everything. And especially in the final book, it was like, let me just break it all down for you, everything that's happened and everything that this has all meant, and let me just tell you in exhaustive detail. And I was exhausted by it. By the time that it was coming to an end, I was so happy for it to be over. I didn't find there to be any emotional connection to anyone in this book, whereas when I read A Little Life, by the end of it, I was devastated. I was listening to it walking in the park as an audiobook, sobbing, like walking down the street, sobbing. And the amount of sobbing in that book is like hours. But I was so invested, like I cared about all of those characters. Into Paradise, I didn't care about any of the characters. Any of them could have just died and I would have been like, okay, whatever, let's keep it moving. Trying to make these interweaving narratives of people with the same names and the people being in the same house. Unlike number 11, where I found those interweaving narratives really charming and really cleverly done and surprising, this just felt like it was just hammering me over the head with it like a mallet. Like, do you get it yet? Do you get it? If not, don't worry, we'll repeat it like 5,000 times until you do get it. Here's another character called David. It was just no fun, and like the misery that she likes to put her characters through just seemed pointless in a way that, like, even in A Little Life, it didn't feel pointless. It felt like you were at least trying to tell a story, and she did put those characters through hell. But this just felt pointless. I didn't care. I didn't care what they were going to do, whether they were going to go to Paradise or not. I was just like, whatever, let's just end it. Quicksand is another one that I picked up at the world's best secondhand bookshop. If it's here, it's good. I'm picking it up, let's go. This is an extremely unhinged book. For something that's very short, it is the twists and the turns. I started reading it thinking, this is normal, this is a normal book. And then within the first couple of chapters, it was like, sorry, what's happening? When I finished reading this, I read the reviews and I saw someone mention that this was originally serialized. So it was written and published over a period of 2 years. That made complete sense. Like, as soon as I realized that, this book made complete sense. Some people say that this is 1920s Cruel Intentions. This is 1920s EastEnders. Just full soap opera all the time. If you expect this to be like a normal book, you're going to be baffled. But if you expect this to be a kind of soap opera in book form, then you're going to have a good time. It's extremely wild. It doesn't necessarily make sense, but I didn't have a bad time. It also made sense that it was serialized because some of the chapters end right in the middle of not just the action, but actually the sentence. So the next sentence starts with "and." So it's literally like a cliffhanger. It was written in the 1920s, published, I think, in the 1930s, and it is scarily current feeling. At times you actually forget that this is an old book. You sort of feel like, oh, it's set in the 20s, but I forgot that this wasn't modern because it was weirdly current feeling, like the way people talked. It felt very contemporary. I also read that this was written in dialect, which sounds really interesting, and obviously that doesn't come across in the translation. So it tells the story of a woman who is in a kind of unhappy marriage, not for any specific reason, but she's bored. She's got a husband who goes off to work, and during the day she doesn't have anything to do, so she starts doing these art classes. And at the art class, she meets this other woman, and through a variety of convoluted events, people start thinking that they are in a relationship. And at first they're not, but they decide to go along and kind of have fun with the rumours and the fact that everyone's spreading these rumours around about them. And then they end up actually having the relationship and becoming lovers. This happens at like the very beginning of the book. How it goes off the rails after this stage, I cannot even describe, but through an incredibly convoluted number of plot points, it becomes a kind of several love triangles where various people are perhaps having affairs with other people. The main character is like an unreliable narrator. She is telling the story, but we don't really know if we believe her and if she's telling it accurately how it really was, or whether she's kind of colouring the events with her own interpretation of events. I found it interesting to read, like it was a really interesting narrative, but it was pretty insane. At the end of it, I was just like, I have no idea what just happened, but I had quite a good time, so why not? Interesting to read something that is just so different to other books. It's kind of fascinating. I kept expecting there to be a final reveal where everything would be explained, but it was an enjoyable ride. It was a wild but ultimately enjoyable ride. Next up, I read Pond by Claire Louise Bennett. This is very no plot, all vibes, but the vibes are good. I enjoyed the vibes. It's basically a woman who moves to a cottage in the countryside. It's about seclusion, solitude. It's a selection of short stories, sometimes prose, sometimes a stream of consciousness, like poetry. It's beautifully written, very enjoyable. Whether you would enjoy this or not depends on how much you enjoy the narrator and whether you like her voice, because there's not much happening. It's really just her talking about her life in this cottage, and it has kind of moments of like the beauty and the wonder of living in the countryside alone, and then it has kind of the darker moments of the inconvenience, the things that aren't so great about it, and the conflict and the problems. I think in the end it just comes down to whether you like the voice of the writer, and I found it to be really like moving and funny, and I just really enjoyed spending time in her world. So I would recommend, if you're looking for a kind of quiet, slower paced, very vibey kind of book where it's really just about atmosphere and her thoughts, her feelings on this kind of idea of solitude and on that theme, I found it really enjoyable. The last thing I read was Camus' The Outsider, and it was incredible. As soon as I finished this, I literally logged onto the library website and put a hold on any other of his books that they had. So I already have The Plague that I've still got on the go right now. This also is one of those everyman's library books, which are really nice. They give you at the beginning context and like timelines of the author's life and other world events. Very good. I would get more of these editions again. The book is about a man that shoots someone and is essentially put on trial for it. It's a very simplistic explanation of what happens. I don't want to say any more in case anyone else didn't know what it was about, because I didn't. I would highly recommend. The way it's written is amazing. I feel really stupid talking about books that are very well known as being like incredible classics. It feels like so trite to be like, it's really good. Everyone knows it's good. Obviously, it's a modern classic. I don't need to tell you that it's really good, but it was really good. I really enjoyed it. Sometimes books that are supposed to be good can be hard work. This wasn't hard work. This was very very captivating from the start. Very interested to see what would happen to the main character and how his story developed, what he was thinking. It's a book that people talk about when discussing existentialism, but then at the end of the book there's a whole kind of afterword about how Camus did not see himself as part of that movement, and it's not existentialist even though everyone says that it is. So that's confusing. I found it very interesting in terms of the protagonist's way of thinking of things and how he sees the world and like what happens to him. The progression of the story did not go how I thought it was going to go. Again, maybe because I'm an idiot and I didn't know what happens in this. And it gave me a lot to think about. It's a classic for a reason, obviously. Like, can't fault it. This was fucking great. So that brings us to the end of March. I will probably stop here because I am incapable of keeping things short and insist on waffling on about things. The next one will hopefully be everything in April and will come in a more timely manner. If you have any recommendations, I'd love to hear them. I'd love to hear what you've been reading, what is the best books that you've read this year, or what you're looking forward to reading in the upcoming months.